With 2024 finally being here and year 9 just around the corner, you need certain settings going into the new year and the new season. Whether you're here for the general, the display, or the graphics settings, make sure you stick to the end. First of all, let's go over the general settings. Now obviously you want your pings on. Having your performance metrics doesn't really matter unless you're trying to gauge your FPS when you first start playing the game. Cycling inside camera groups is personal preference, but one thing that you do need to have is your drone after prep on manual. Putting your drone after prep on manual makes it to where if you're droning and the prep phase ends, the drone doesn't immediately just kick you off of it. It makes it to where if you're on your drone and the prep phase ends, you can continue driving your drone outside of the building. A lot of the times what will happen is you'll drive your drone away from a defender, and right before you leave the building, you get kicked off your drone and the defender shoots your drone. If you had it on manual, this wouldn't be the case. Now, some people will switch their drone after prep to semi-automatic because it still does that while also making it to where if you're on your teammates' drones, you can get off of it at the same time. Some people think it's a healthy balance between automatic and manual, but I disagree. Semi-automatic makes it to where the only time that you manually have to get off of your drone if it is on your own drone. But if you want to watch cutoff cameras for your teammates, then you don't want that because it'll kick you off your drone and you'll have to get back on. And in those few seconds of you having to fiddle around with your camera, a defender could have passed by your cutoff camera, which you don't want. And a lot of the times that will happen, a lot more than you think. So just pressing an extra button by putting it on manual is something that is definitely worth switching the setting for. If you're on console, crossplay matchmaking doesn't matter if you go against PS4 players as an Xbox player or vice versa. However, if you do have it on, you need to make sure that you have your crossplay communication on. That way you can actually communicate with other people that are on different consoles. But that's it for the general settings. Next, let's go over the HUD settings. Now, for the HUD settings, honestly, you can just keep this on normal. This is all pretty much personal preference here. One thing that I like to do specifically, though, is I like to have my compass appearance on simplified. Now, a few seasons ago, they changed the compass and they made it a bit more complicated, which is what's known as the advanced compass appearance. If you want to revert back to the old compass, however, which I like to do because it's just more simple, you can put it on the simplified version. Another thing that people don't like to have on is the action reminders. Action reminders are these little instructions below your crosshair. Right here it says hold F to remove the barricade. If I break the barricade, it will say, hold F to put the barricade back up, or press space to vault through the window. Those are action reminders, and a lot of people don't like to have those whenever they play their game, because if you play the game for more than 30 hours, you'll know what to do. So you can turn that off, but personally, I like to keep it on, and that's for one reason and one reason only. The bottom right window on Oregon is a great example of a runout that people love to do. Whenever they do this, they'll typically break open part of the barricade and then they'll melee the side just like this so that it's more silent and they don't hear you breaking the barricade. But a lot of times this will bug out and just plainly not work. So whenever you want to run out of the barricade, it just won't let you. Because sometimes when you melee the side of the barricade, it just won't register as a melee. So in order to ensure that you know if it's vaultable or not, those action reminders can actually help you so that you're not just standing in front of a barricade waiting to vault and then you can't do it. Which can sometimes get you killed if the barricade is partially broken or they're just pre-firing it. But with the vault action reminder here, I know, hey, it actually registered and I can vault through the window and get an easy kill. So I like to keep it on, but there's a bunch of different things that you can turn off, like no text, icons only, input only, whatever it may be. If you want the actual action reminders, but you don't want them to be super obvious, you can also turn down the opacity of it as well. It just makes it a little bit more see-through, so it's not so in the way. But pretty much everything else in terms of your HUD is completely optional. Moving on to much more important settings though, let's go over the audio settings. Now, apart from the obvious settings of turning on the correct input and output device for your mic and your headset, there's some stuff that we need to go over. Specifically, the dynamic range. Now, this is actually dependent. If you're on a TV and the audio that you're hearing is from the actual TV or monitor, then put it on TV. This works for speakers as well. But if you're not a troglodyte, then you typically want it on hi-fi or night mode. But which one do you pick? Now, hi-fi has higher sound quality and higher frequency ranges, meaning that you'll be able to hear an assortment of different things whenever you have it on. The only issue with hi-fi is it makes explosions and gunfire really loud, which will in turn make footsteps quieter. Night mode specifically makes those gunfire and explosion sounds a lot quieter, so you can hear footsteps a lot better and from farther distances, which I personally really like. To show you this, as you can hear, I've turned my volume all the way up, and I'm going to shoot bullets. This is what the gunfire sounds like with night mode on. And this is what gunfire sounds like with hi-fi on. As you can clearly see, the gunfire in hi-fi was much louder, which can get pretty annoying and actually make you have to turn down your headset, which will further make it to where you just can't hear enemies. But if you have a third-party equalizer, whether it be through an app, through a stream deck, or through an actual mic equalizer, you can change how loud the gunfire and bullets are and how loud footsteps are. So if you have that, then I actually would recommend putting on hi-fi, that way you still get the good audio quality. But most people don't have that, so putting on night mode is going to be your best bet. Now, in terms of the other audio settings, there are 3 that I specifically want to talk about: the voice chat volume, the voice chat input volume, and the voice chat input sensitivity. Now, for whatever reason, I can't seem to change them right now, but you should definitely be able to. The voice chat volume is how loud your teammates are whenever they're talking. So if your teammates are really loud, you can easily go into your audio settings and just turn this down. The voice chat input volume is how loud you are. So if your teammates are saying, hey, you're really quiet, or hey, you're really loud, you should turn this up or down accordingly. The voice chat input sensitivity, however, is the actual threshold for what your mic considers to be audio that it needs to display versus what it doesn't need to. So for example, if you have a really loud fan on, or in my example, a really squeaky chair, sometimes your teammates can hear that, and just your chair squeaking or your fan being active will activate your mic and keep it active, which is bad. You never want to hear somebody's fan the entire round. If this is the case, you can just turn down your voice chat input sensitivity, so that the only time that your mic activates is if a really loud sound happens, which typically is just you speaking into your microphone. So if people complain that they can hear background noises, just turn this down. Or if you're having trouble activating your mic here and there, turn this up. Something that's much more important though than audio settings is your display settings. Now, the first important thing in the display section is your resolution. You want this on the highest it can possibly be. Mine can go up to this resolution, but I really don't like the way that it makes my game look, so I personally keep it at 1920 by 1080, but as long as it's around here, you should be good. Next, you want your display mode on full screen. If you put it on windowed or borderless, it caps you out at 60 Hz, as you can see here. But now that I put it at full screen, I can go to the max amount of hertz that my monitor can actually respond to. Now, your aspect ratio matters a lot. The game natively will put you on 16:9, which is what I actually have right now in this video. As you can see, I'm on 16:9. The issue with this is because everything is narrow, that means that player models are also narrow, which will in turn make them seem skinnier and make them seem smaller. And smaller things, whenever they're moving faster, you have way less of a reaction time to react to. If they're much wider though, you'll see their arms and their shoulders a lot faster because they're so thick and wide. So you want to have your monitor on stretched res. That's just how it is. The best stretched res setting that most people run is 4:3. You can optionally run a slimmer version of that on 3:2 or a wider version of that on 5:4, but 4:3 is usually the middle ground if you want to run a wide stretched res. If you don't want to do wide stretched res, but you still want the advantages of wide stretched res, maybe just because you don't like the way that the display looks, you can optionally run 1610 as well. A lot of players that are really good at the game run 1610 just purely for a challenge, but also so they can keep the same game look. It's purely up to you. But for the majority of players, you want this to be on 4:3. Now, if you're on 4:3, your field of view is going to change. Depending on your aspect ratio, there is an optimal field of view. A lot of people just crank it up to 90 and don't really think about it, which you can do, but I don't personally recommend that. What I do recommend you do, though, is if you are on 4:3, like I told you to do, you either want to be running 87, 90, or 83. Now, personally, I love to run 87. I find it to be the middle ground between 83 and 90. If you crank up your field of view all the way to 90, it makes it seem a lot wider, sure, but what it also does, because your field of view is so high, is it makes your crosshair and your scope a lot narrower, because you're stretching out the sides and therefore narrowing in your scopes. If you decide to put it on 83, you have the opposite problem. Your scope might seem a little bit more zoomed in, but you're not able to see peripherals as much, which can be the difference between you seeing and killing somebody and them shooting you in the back. So personally, 87 for me and for most other people is the perfect middle ground between your peripheral vision and being able to see people in your scope. I just love it a lot. The same can be said for 5.4 and 4.3 too. Although the FOV might change a little bit, it's pretty much the same. The only time you would ever reliably run 90 is if you're running on 1610, or optionally on 3.2 as well. Moving on from field of view and aspect ratio though, let's go into the HUD display area. The HUD display area most people have at the maximum. I personally prefer it on the minimum. The HUD takes up less space and you have a wider peripheral vision, and once you put it on minimum and you run it for a few days, you'll never want to go back to this clunky 100 HUD display area. It just does not make sense. Now the final and one of the most important display settings we should go over is the brightness. You never want your brightness to be above 65 or below 55. This is kind of just the golden rule for brightnesses that allow you to see people if you're spawn peeking on super bright maps, kind of like Clubhouse. If you were to make this super bright, kind of like this, it would be much harder to see any people that had a white uniform on, or anybody that's on the rappel or on top of the roof. It doesn't really matter. And overall, it kind of just looks ugly too. I really don't like it. The same thing goes for turning it way too dark. If you turn it way too dark and you look in long corridors, you'll have a much harder time seeing enemies that are hiding in little prone corners like this, just because your game is so dark. So I've personally found that 60 brightness just happens to be the best brightness. Moving on from the display settings, we have arguably one of the most underrated and important settings, which is your graphics settings. Now, I have everything on my personal graphics settings on super high just because it makes recording videos look super better, but you do not want this. Funny enough, even if you have a bleeding edge tech PC like I do, you want everything on low. This makes it to where your graphics card and your computer in general doesn't have to work as hard to get you the game quality that you want, which will in turn get you more frames per second, which we talked about earlier being very important. Now, in terms of other graphics settings, you want your texture filtering to be linear, for the exact same reason that you have your other settings on low. It just makes your FPS run a bit better, and the filtering doesn't really matter. The only thing that you really want to set higher is your LOD quality. Your LOD quality is actually pretty important, and I'd recommend having it from high to ultra. Now, I brought you onto Clubhouse to show you this. If you look at this brick wall right here, something really weird happens when you ADS. Don't you see that it kind of like wiggles and stretches a little bit? Well, that's because your LOD quality is set to low, and the further and further away you get from the brick wall, just the more like blurry it becomes. It's a little weird. But if you turn your quality up to ultra, that no longer becomes the case. The bricks appear the same exact way, at the same exact quality, from no matter how far away you are. The same thing will go for plants as well, and people love to hide Valkyrie cameras in plants, so you just want to have your LOD up high as possible. One other setting that you want higher than the rest is your shadow quality. The reason for this being is because you want to be able to see shadows for certain examples like the clubhouse door. As you can see, shadows tend to point to the left because the source of light on this map is the sun that is over there on the right. This means that if anybody is on the right side of this door, their shadow will appear, allowing you, the person in rafters, to see their shadow on the floor way before you actually see the player, which can be the difference between you seeing them and winning the gunfight, or losing the gunfight and losing the game. Now, it's not just example. There's a few other examples and a few other maps, but you get the general idea. You just want your shadows to be on. And as long as you have it on medium or above, they will be on. So you don't need it on very high because it's gonna, take your PC or whatever. You can just have it on medium and that will work. Make sure also that your zoom in depth of field is off. You always want to be able to see your peripherals even when you're zoomed in, so having this off is amazing. In terms of anti-aliasing, you have two options. You can turn it on TAA or you can turn it off. Most players opt to turn it off, which I recommend you do because in Siege, it doesn't even work. Like, it just does not even work. Or TAA if you want a higher sharpness or render scaling to spawn peak better. Either way, it doesn't really matter. Personally, though, I just recommend that you have it off. It's not worth keeping. But that's it for the graphics settings. We had a lot of stuff there that wasn't really personal preference, but the controls section is completely personal preference. Now, my sensitivity is on 6.6, and I don't have a sensitivity multiplier built into the code of the game, so this is actually native to the game. This is what my mouse ADS sensitivity looks like. It should look more or less the same, with the 1x being a little lower than the rest of them, just due to the fact that 1x magnifications don't actually zoom in at all, so it should be pretty close to what you have in general. With your other magnifications, though, you want everything a little bit more zoomed in, and you want it to be increasing slightly throughout just because your magnifications are obviously slightly increased. But don't copy anybody's sensitivity because you want to aim like them. The only reason they aim as good as they aim is because they have thousands of hours on their sensitivity. So find one that suits you and just keep playing with it. One thing I like to have enabled is the mouse scroll. This makes it to where I can switch weapons without having to press 1 or 2. I can just scroll my mouse and it does it for me. Something else that's wildly important though is your drone deployment. You want this on advanced. Let's say I am outside the lobby door just like this, and I know that a defender is sitting on this double door waiting to swing me. Now instead of just swinging and trying to take a risky gunfight, what I can do is I can get on my drone and try to drone him out. But if I'm a defender and I see someone and hear someone throw a drone out, I'm immediately just going to swing them and kill them whilst they're on their drone. But if you turn your drone deployment on advanced, it makes it to where you don't get on your drone the second you throw it. So if I'm a smart player, I know that they're going to try to swing me when I throw my drone out. So I'm going to throw my drone out, wait for them to swing me, and get a free kill because they're not suspecting me to have my gun up because they just saw me throw my drone. Having advanced drone deployment allows you to get these free kills as bait, so you can get kills on players that are way too aggressive trying to swing you whenever you put your drone out. Not only do you want drone deployment on advanced, but you also want gadget deployment on advanced as well. Let's take thermite for example. Now commonly people will use thermite to open up the CC wall for Clubhouse. And a lot of the times defenders will sit on the opposite side of the wall and bandit trick to make sure no aces or thermites can open the wall. Now, typically with a thermite you'll have a thatcher or some sort of EMPs to help you destroy those bandits so you can get the wall open. But if they EMP the wall and you have your gadget deployment on simplified, it makes it to where you have to immediately deploy your gadget on the wall as soon as you activate it, which is bad. This is because taking the gadget out and then deploying it takes a lot more time than just deploying it. But if you have your gadget deployment on advanced, this is no longer the case. It allows you to sit outside the wall with their thermite charge out, while you wait for the EMPs to disable the bandits, and then as it's being disabled, you can put your thermite on the wall, which saves you a good few seconds that it would normally take for you to pull the thermite charge out, which can be the difference in seconds between you opening the wall and the bandit having the reaction time to bandit trick your thermite off of the wall. So you definitely want gadget deployment on advanced. Some console settings though include having your dead stick zone turned down pretty low. You want it low because you don't want to have to move your entire joystick a good inch before it actually decides to input that you're moving your joystick. It just does not make sense. The same thing can be said for triggers. You just want them low. Also, having vibration disabled is optional, but personally I would do it just because it's less input that your brain has to worry about. So that can be the difference between you making a good cognitive decision and not making one. You know, it's pretty not important, but I would just turn it off. One thing I also recommend doing is turning your lean onto toggle, especially if you're new. This will allow you to have a lot more mechanical and quick peeks, but there are people like Shock who have it on hold and can aim just the same. I'm just like that as well. It doesn't really matter to me. So personally, I mean, it doesn't really matter, but I'd put it on toggle. Moving into the privacy settings, none of this matters. If you want to hide names, change your names, this is where you would do it. Something that matters a bit more though is the accessibility tab. Specifically your optic colors. There are some optic colors that are better than others. Now the reason this is so important specifically is because there are some maps like Coastline, as you can see, where it's very bright outside. And if I were to change my crosshair to a super bright color, like let's say white, it's almost impossible to see anybody whenever you're spawn peeking because the crosshair blends in with the environment so much, especially at higher brightness settings. And it gets even worse if you have 1x scopes as well. Now you really cannot see anything. As opposed to a color like black, where now it's super easy to see your crosshair and super easy to use it as reference to kill enemy players inside the spawn. But even black crosshairs have their drawbacks, because if you're shooting through things that are actually colored, now it's a lot harder to see people whenever you're spawn peeking. So what crosshair color should you use? Well, there's 5 options for you. The first one is just the default crosshair, which makes everything red with the exception of some green crosshairs like people on Ella or Malusi. Red is great because there are not a lot of places that are red, which makes it stand out a lot more, especially compared to enemy heads. But unfortunately, there are stuff that is red, like this red part of the wall in VIP or the red stairs on Cafe. So if that doesn't work, then you should try just straight up green. Green still stands out, and you can use it to shoot players, but it is a little bright at certain times, especially on, maps like this. And maps like Emerald Plains as well, where there are green hallways. Something a bit darker if you still like the green color is turquoise. It adds a bit more blue to the green crosshair, which makes it a tad bit darker, so it's a little easier to see. But personally, I don't like any of those. Honestly, I just like straight up purple. Purple's great, because there's not a lot of purple places where the crosshair is going to blend into a purple wall, or a purple staircase, or a purple spawn. So purple is often considered one of the best crosshairs in the game. Same thing with the red crosshair, so honestly just picking between these two or one of the green ones is not a terrible choice. In terms of other accessibility options, the screen shake intensity should be set to off. The reason for this being is if you explode something, your screen will just shake a bunch, and that's not fun. Especially if you're trying to shoot off of something after you explode something. Your crosshair just kind of goes everywhere because your screen is shaking and you can't really shoot people. But if you turn it off, the second you explode something, there's no screen shake. So you can ash rush with an ash charge, or explode a breaching charge and immediately walk in with no screen shake, which allows you to kill people a lot easier. Now, in terms of team or opposing team color, I like team color on red and opposing team color on blue. This is due to the fact that if you're a defender looking for claymores, there are certain stairs like red stairs on Cafe where the claymore lines will blend in. So you want to put the opposing team color on blue because it makes it way easier to spot claymores. Also, it makes it easier to spot things like Valkyrie cameras if you're playing against a Valkyrie, so I definitely recommend you have the opposing team color on blue and your team color on red. But those are all of the settings that really matter and that you need to start using in 2024. If you like this video, check out this next video. My name's Alka, and I'll see you there. Later.